All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another video. As you can see from the title, this video is going to be a guide to exploitative bluff catching. This is the hand that sort of inspired the video, if you will. So in this particular spot, we are blind on blind versus a reg, and we have the queen nine off and call an open. The flop comes down ace, ace 3. Our opponent goes 25% on the flop and we click the call button. The turn comes the 9 and the action goes check, check. And then on the river, our opponent goes for a 150% pot river overbet. And we elect to call the river with our queen 9. And we get shown the queen 10. Now, on the surface of this, you might look at this hand and think, okay, standard stuff, Simon, move on to the next hand. You know, you have a bluff catcher on the river. You have a nice call in theory on the river. What's so special about this hand? This hand, I think, is an example of me putting my exploitative hat on the river, which is often something I will very much do in these bluff catching spots. And the reason is because our opponent in this spot has turned up with a hand with such as queen 10, which is quite simply just a hand that should never be bluffed. It's a hand that should just go to showdown and move on, okay? And in this video, we're going to kind of talk about my exploitative process and touch on how we can make deviations on the river based on our opponent's tendencies that can lead to very, very profitable river decisions, okay? Because if we put this into the solver says, congratulations, you have a, relatively zero EV decision. You might mix call and you might mix fold and so on versus the river overbet. But the reality of this situation is that if our opponent is going to bluff a hand like queen 10, our bluff catch with queen 9 is actually going to be very, very profitable. So yeah, excited for the video. Strap yourselves in. Let's talk about exploitative bluff catching and let's have some fun. All right, so I think it's always a good starting point to start with the theory, okay? If you think about like theory poker and exploitative poker comes from theory, okay? You can't exploit someone if you don't have an idea as to what the theory is. So we're going to very briefly run through the theory of bluff catching, and then we're going to talk about how to adjust and what we can do exploitatively. Now, super simple, what is a bluff catcher? A bluff catcher is, of course, a hand that loses to all of villain's value and beats all of their bluffs. All bluff catchers are inherently zero EV or indifferent at the equilibrium. Okay, so all of our bluff catchers, if we were playing the solver, will make zero money, give or take. And to force indifference, the solver will find the exact value to bluff ratio. Okay, so if you're facing a pot size bet on the river, due to the maths of the spot, you are going to be facing a range that should have 2 value combos for 1 bluff combo. Okay, and that is then going to make you zero EV with your bluff catchers on the river. Now, in theory, what separates a call from a fold is going to be our blocker properties. Okay, so when bluff catching the river, we want to block our opponent's value combos and unblock their bluffing combos. Okay, so we're going to just jump into a very, very quick sim just to illustrate this. So, as you can see here, we've got a single raise pot, button versus big blind, ace 7-3. The button is c-bet small on the flop. The turn has gone check, check. The river comes a 2 and it is up to the button, and we've given them the option for pot or check. And the button goes ahead and bets the pot, and we have a bluff catching decision with everything that is king high all the way up to an underpair, all the way up to pocket nines. Okay. And what we can see here is blocker effects at play. All right, you can see that most of these bluff catchers are going to be inherently zero EV. Okay, so they're always going to hover around zero EV or something close. But you can see a hand like king 3 is going to be probably one of the best bluff catchers we have, because it completely unblocks our opponent's bluffing region, as they're not meant to bluff king high, and it blocks value. It blocks ace 3, it blocks ace king. All right, so that's a very, very good bluff catching combo in theory. Pocket sixes, on the other hand, is not a very good bluff catching combo because it blocks a lot of our opponent's bluffs, as you can see here, and it doesn't really do an amazing job of blocking value. A little bit of a6, a little bit of a6 off. Okay, so this is the theory behind the spot. All right, your blocker properties are going to dictate whether you can call the river or whether you can fold the river. Okay, the issue is, if we go back to our nice presentation, what if our opponent does not find the perfect value to bluff ratio like the solver? Okay, what if they bet the pot on the river and their range does not contain 2 value combos for every 1 bluff combo? What do we do then? And if we plug this into a solver, how would it adjust? Let's find out. Right, so to illustrate the point I'm about to make, we're actually going to use a toy game example in PioSolver. So what we have here is the classic toy game board of 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 3. Okay, so high card is going to win here. The out of position player has pocket aces, i.e. the nuts, and pocket fours, i.e. the nut low. Okay, so value or bluff. And the in position player has a range that consists solely of pocket nines. Okay, so a bluff catcher. And this is a super simplistic way of looking at bluff catcher. What we've done is we've delayed all of the action to the river, and the starting pot is 100, the effective stacks are 100, and both players just have the option of going all in or checking. Okay, so what this means is the strategy for the out of position player who has the pocket aces is to shove their pocket aces every single time because it's the nuts and it just wins. And to find the correct value to bluff ratio, you can see that pocket fours is shoving precisely 50% of the time, right? 2 value combos for 1 bluff combo when we're betting the pot on the river. What this means is pocket nines is exactly 0 EV. Okay, you can see it's calling 50% of the time and it's folding 50% of the time in this toy game where there are no blocker effects going on. All right, so this is essentially how bluff catching works in theory. Okay, with no blocker effects, this is what should be happening. Now, what we can do with PioSolver is we can use their very, very handy node lock function. A little slip of the tongue there. Function. And we can basically say to the solver, okay, what happens if you overbluff, Mr. Solver? All right, what happens if you get a little bit too tempted with those pocket fours and you want to try and win the hand rather than just giving up? What happens then? All right. So we node lock this in, we click the go button, and now we can see that aces is still, of course, shoving every single time, but pocket fours down here is now shoving a little bit more, right? We've added an extra % of bet into here. Okay, so this is a very, very good example of illustrating what sometimes a human might do, right? Sometimes a human is going to overbluff the river. If that is the case, and we do face an overbluff on the river, you can see that pocket nines is no longer 0 EV, right? It is now winning 2.6 big blinds, and it is now calling the river every single time, okay? And for the sake of transparency, we can also do this the other way around. So we can just make the solver under bluffers on the river by 1%. Doesn't need to be much. And you will now see that pocket nines is a pure fold every single time and loses 2.7 big blinds. Okay, so what can we take from this? Well, we can simplify our bluff catching approach. Okay, instead of trying to figure out what our blockers are on the river and try to find, calls that have the perfect blockers, I block his value, I unblock his bluffs. Sometimes you can actually take an even more simplistic approach and ask yourself the question, is my opponent going to overbluff the river, or is my opponent going to underbluff the river? Okay, and if you can figure this out with any kind of accuracy, you're going to start making incredibly profitable river decisions when you're bluff catching the river. Are they going to overbluff? Are they going to underbluff? If they're going to overbluff, I'm going to call all of my bluff catchers. If they're going to underbluff, I'm going to fold all of my bluff catchers. Okay, this is exploitative bluff catching 101, if you will. All right, so I can almost hear you watching this and going, okay, Simon, that's all well and good, but how do I know? How do I know if my opponent is going to overbluff the river or underbluff the river? How am I supposed to figure that out? Well, let's find out. Right, so how can we figure this out? Right, how can we identify these exploitative bluff catching spots and figure out if our opponent is going to overbluff or if they're going to underbluff on the river? Okay. One key thing I like to do when trying to figure out if someone is going to overbluff or underbluff the river is to understand the concept of bluff allowance. All right. Now, this is honestly exactly what it says on the tin, right? How many of villains' bluffing candidates are they allowed to bluff the river with? Okay. Are they allowed to bluff really, really often and bluff almost every bluff? Or are they allowed to bluff very, very minimally and have to give up hands that always lose at showdown? Okay, so just going into a couple of sims here to illustrate this, we'll go back into our first sim where we see bet the flop as the button, the big blind calls, turn goes check, check, and then the river comes a 2, and it is up to the button for pot or check on the river, right? This is going to be an example of a relatively low bluff allowance on the river. Okay, so you can see that with our no made hand, with our bluffing candidates, we arrive here with 53, give or take, combos to potentially bluff with. But due to the fact that we don't have that much value in this line, and obviously we're trying to play at the equilibrium, or the solver's trying to play at the equilibrium, you can only bluff with 27.5 bluffing combos. Okay, so what this means is it means you have to check back 9-6 some of the time and just lose every single time, or you have to check back Jack 6 or Jack 9, right? And believe you me, when you check back, you just lose the hand. Okay, so this is an example of a low bluff allowance. All right, what we can also do is look at an example, of a high bluff allowance. This is the same flop where the button has c-bet and the big blind is called. The turn is exactly the same. However, this time the button has continued to barrel for the pot and the big blind is called. And then the river has come down the 10 of hearts, right? It is now checked to the button again. And you can see that this is how often we're allowed to bluff our bluffing candidates on the river here. So king high and below, you can see that we're basically bluffing every bluff. Okay, so this is an example of a very, very high bluff allowance, right? If we arrive to the river in this particular spot with our bluffing combos, we're pretty much allowed to bluff every single bluff. Okay, so a great rule of thumb for understanding bluff allowance in terms of an exploitative angle is the higher our opponent's bluff allowance, the more likely the spot is actually to be underbluffed. Okay, so if we look at our ace 7 3 8 10 sim where we're facing a triple barrel, this is a spot that in reality is actually quite likely to be underbluffed. Okay, because even in the solver is allowed to follow through and bluff every single bluff. Okay, the lower our opponent's bluff allowance, the more likely the spot is to be overbluffed. Okay, so if we go back to our original sim, this is a spot that is very, very likely to be overbluffed by human beings because human beings don't really like checking back 9 high and 6 high and always losing. Okay, so you have to be very in touch with your frequencies here. And because your bluff allowance is low, you have to give up hands that always lose at showdown. So this means that it is very easy for our opponents to overbluff the river here and just go, well, I have 9 high, I'm going to bluff. And therefore, this is a prime example of a spot where overcalling can be very, very profitable. The spot previously, where we're facing the triple barrel, is a prime spot where we want to be looking at overfolding. Okay. Now, this is all very well and good, right? When we've got the solver to be able to check what our opponent's bluff allowance is, right? This would be a very, very easy game if we were able to just have the solver up on our screen and just go, oh, look, they're not allowed to bluff very often here, therefore I'm going to call everything. Or, oh, look, they're allowed to bluff every bluff here. Okay, I'll probably err on the side of caution and overfold. Okay, we cannot obviously do that whilst we're playing. So what we need to do is we need to understand why bluff allowance changes, right? Why do you have to give up bluffs on the river? Why do you have to give up 6 high on the river? Why are you not allowed to follow through every bluff? And in what kind of spots are you allowed to bluff every bluff, right? What impacts bluff allowance? Okay. Now, the first point we'll make here is if our opponent takes a line where their value combos are diminished, then the bluff allowance is likely to be very low. Okay. So if we go back into our original sim, right, and we actually have a look at the turn, which is often an inflection point, right? On the turn, we can see that our opponent's value combos here are betting very, very often, right? You've got sets, 2 pairs, and top pairs, right? They are going to go into the betting line relatively often. Okay, so you've got 45 to 46 combos of value that are going to go into that betting line. All right. If we look at the bluffing region or the air region that is going to go into the betting line, all right, what we're looking at here is a lot of check back, right? You can see 95 combos of king high and below are going into the check-in line, right? Of course, we're putting some bluff combos into the betting line, but the majority are going into the check-in line, right? The majority of our value, well, not quite the majority, but a lot of our value is going into the betting line. It's not going into the check-in line. So what this means on the river, when we look at our ranges, is we only have about a quarter of our range that we arrive in this checking line on the river that's able to value bet, right? We only have 50 combos of value, give or take, okay? The issue is that we also have, as mentioned, 53 combos of potential bluffs, all right? And if we're going to be betting the pot on the river, as mentioned, we can't just bluff 50 combos of bluffs because then we're not actually making our opponent indifferent on the river, okay? So we've always got to consider where our value is going and where our air is going to go, okay? And very often, the action is going to be able to tell you what your opponent's bluff allowance is going to be, all right? If you are facing a continuous line, very often, as I say, the value is going to go into that line. There will be some air that's going to go into that line as well, but very often, the air is disproportionately going to go into the check back, even in the solver, right? It's not proportionate. It's going to go into that check back line, all right? And likewise, as I say, the value region very often is going to go into the betting line more than it's going to go into that check back line, all right? So there's always going to be this mismatch, okay? And just understanding the action, am I in a broken line, i.e. a check at some point, or am I in a continuous line, okay, i.e. a triple or whatever it might be? Bluff allowances tend to be higher in the continuous lines than they are in the broken lines. Okay, so if you're in a broken line, the bluff allowance is often going to be very, very low. All right, if you're in a continuous line, the bluff allowance on average is going to be higher. Okay, so you can always bear that in mind. Am I in a continuous line or am I in a broken line? Point number 2 is a little bit more psychological. All right, if you arrive to the river with an air-heavy range, then you often need to give up with hands that always lose at showdown. I've mentioned this already, but it's important to kind of understand, all right? If you understand the theory of bluffing and bluff allowance, right, you probably will know that if you arrive to the river in this particular spot where you've c-bet the flop small and you've check back the turn, you know you actually have a lot of air on the river, okay? You know that you're not supposed to bluff every bluff, okay? But the issue is we're humans, right? And one really common sort of, I mean, it's basically a mindset leak, but one really common leak that we tend to have as human beings is we try to win the hand. And this might actually sound kind of a bit of a mental thing to say, like, well, of course I'm trying to win the hand, Simon. The more hands I win, the more money I make, right? The solver doesn't try and win the hand. The solver takes the most profitable action it can. Okay, and the solver in this situation has basically decided that, okay, I can't bluff 9-6 of hearts every single time. That is not the most profitable thing to do. Okay, I can't bluff 6-5 every time. I can't bluff Jack-9 every single time. Okay, so the solver doesn't actually care that it loses the hand, right? It will check back 9 high and lose every single time, and it doesn't care because it is just taking the most profitable action. Okay, humans don't work like this. How many, hands up, how many of us are checking back 9 high on the river here, right? Probably not many. Probably not many of us at all, right? Because if we check, we lose. If we check, we know we lose the hand. But if we bet, our opponent might fold, right? And then therefore we win the hand. Even though you could say to us, well, Simon, betting 9 high on the river is probably not going to be profitable here. A lot of us won't care because we want to win the hand. Oh, well, if I win the hand, then I win the hand and I can move on. Feels good. So this is a really common sort of, as I say, mindset leak that we as humans tend to have. We try and win the hand. And to bluff appropriately on the river, if you're trying to win the hand, very often that's going to lead you to make mistakes. And if you can correctly identify where your opponents are going to make these mistakes, bluff catching becomes really, really easy. Okay, so again, another good pro tip with understanding bluff allowance is if our opponent's bluff allowance is going to be low, that means that they need to check back hands that always lose at showdown. Okay, if that is going to be the case, especially when the pot is very small, it's likely to be overbluffed. Okay, the bigger the pot gets, the more people don't mind giving up on the river, right? If it's shove or check on the river for all of the minerals, a lot of people aren't going to mind too much that they're going to go and give up their Jack-9 off here or whatever it is. But when the pot is very small, people don't really care about bluffing as much, right? Because the pot's small. Oh, well, if they call, they call. I lose a small pot. But if I bet, I can potentially win the hand. Okay, so understanding this kind of psychology can also help you with bluff catching on the river. The final point I want to make on bluff allowance and kind of identifying when bluff allowance is going to be high or when bluff allowance is going to be low is understanding the run out. Okay, and this is really, really important. The better the run out is for your opponent, the higher the bluff allowance is going to be, and vice versa. Okay, so one good pro tip when you're studying is to just go through lots of different turns and lots of different rivers and have a look at the equities in the solver. Okay, the better the run out is for your opponent, the more they are allowed to bluff, right? So if we go back into our continuous line with the 10 river, right, you can see that on the 10 river, we're allowed to bluff every bluff, pretty much. Why? Why are we allowed to bluff every bluff in this particular line? Well, because the 10 is probably one of the best rivers in the deck, right? Why is it one of the best rivers in the deck? Well, let's just have a look at what we bluff the turn with, right? Jack 10, Jack 10, Queen 10, offsuit, Queen 10, offsuit, right? Jack 9, which is now the nuts, 9-6, which is now a straight, okay? 10-6, which is now a pair, 10-9, which is now a pair, okay? The 10 smashes our bluffing region, okay? Our value remains our value, right? Our two pairs are still very strong and can still go ahead and could still go ahead and value bet the river, okay? But we've absolutely just drilled this river when the river is a 10. Okay, and you can see this reflected in the equities, okay? If, on the other hand, the river was a 3, what you're going to see now is obviously a 3 is not an amazing river for the in-position player, right? The equities shift dramatically. They shift so dramatically, in fact, that the big blind can have a leading range if they wanted to, okay? So the bad river, the equity shift, that means that our bluff allowance, as you can see, is now ridiculously low. Okay, so what we want to do and how we can study bluff allowance is we want to play around with turns and rivers and we want to understand, okay, what makes a good river, what makes a bad river, okay? Very often, especially when you're in the betting lines, good rivers are going to be the ones that complete things, right? They're going to be ones that connect with the bluffs. Bad rivers are going to be the ones where that doesn't really happen. Right, okay, so a paired river in a continuous line, almost always a bad river for the aggressor, right? They just arrived to the river and now 50% of their range is air, right? So if you understand runouts and if you play around with these and you can kind of figure out, oh, that's probably not a great river for my opponent, you're then able to understand, okay, that's not a great river for him. His bluff allowance is going to be really low. Okay, his bluff allowance is really low. What does that mean? He might be overbluffing here. It's really easy to overbluff here because, as you can see, you have to give up 75% of the time with your bluffs on this particular river. Okay, when that's the case, it's a little bit too tempting to just follow through with your 6-5 or your 9-6 or your 10-6 or whatever it might be. It's very tempting. It's actually very difficult to underbluff this, right? And this is, again, like a psychological thing. A lot of people, I, again, do a lot of coaching and I do this, kind of session with a lot of my students and they'll turn around to me and say, yeah, but I was playing in these pools that I play in. Oh my God, these guys check back 10-9 all the time. They never bluff and so on. You're actually meant to check back 10-9. As you can see, you're meant to check it back pure. And because we only see the 10-9 in this spot and we look at it and think, oh my god, he's checked back the hand that always loses on the river, we tend to label people as nits, right? And just go, oh, these guys never bluff, therefore I should never call. When in reality, this is what you should be doing. You should be giving up with the 10-9s of the world. As I say, it's very difficult to not follow through enough on the river here. You just, if you give up every single bluffing candidate on the river here, then sure, you're going to be under bluffing. Are most regs doing that? Probably not. Okay. So again, understand the runout. All right. Who does the runout impact? If the runout is better for the aggressor, then their bluff allowance is likely to be higher. If the bluff allowance is likely to be higher, it's harder to overbluff. All right. If the runout is worse for them, the bluff allowance is likely to be lower. And when the bluff allowance is lower, they're likely to overbluff. Okay. So let's bring this together with a hand history. All right, so we're going to jump into the replay first of all, and we're going to look at the hand history that I've picked out here. And then we're going to go into the solver, and we're going to look at the idea of bluff allowance. We're maybe going to do a little bit of node locking, and we're going to see how good of an exploitative bluff catch I made on this particular run out and on this particular river. So we're playing 400 NL on iPoker, a blind on blind spot. Small blind open, big blind calls. Flop is 6-4-4. Our opponent checks and we check back our ace-9. Turn comes a offsuit 7 and my opponent elects to go for a 1/3 delay c-bet size, and we have a pretty trivial continue with ace-9 here. Not going to be folding much, if any, ace-high for this sizing, I don't believe. And then the river comes down, the king of diamonds, and our opponent elects to go for a 75% size, and we make the call with our ace-9. And our opponent shows us the jack-8 offsuit. Okay, so you might look at this hand history and think, okay, all very standard, all very well played, move on. But this is a prime spot for where I believe my opponent's bluff allowance on this particular river and on this particular run out and with the action is actually going to be very, very low. And I think my opponent is highly likely to overbluff on this particular run out and on this particular river. And I think the ace-9 here is a call that I would be, well, it was a call that I was making every single time. But this is a spot where I would be calling every single one of my bluff catchers. Okay, so let's analyze this in the solver and let's see what we can figure out. The board is 6-4-4. Our opponent should play a high frequency of check on this board, as we have a nice and healthy trips advantage here as the big blind. So that is going to dictate how much bet that the out position player can do. They check and we decide to check back our ace-9 offsuit. Turn comes the 7 and I've given the out position player the option to play block or check. And as you can see on this particular turn, once it does go check, the out position player gets to be very aggressive. They get to go ahead and bet pretty much any pair, a lot of ace high and so on for value, protection, and all of that good stuff. And they also get to bluff very wide on this particular turn. This is often, down to the action and also the fact that they've checked quite a strong range on the flop. So they go for the 1/3 size, and you can see that we are forced to defend every single ace high. We're forced to defend pretty much every single king high, and we're also forced to defend some queen highs and some random gut shots and open enders and so on. So we're not folding very often on this particular turn. Our opponent, I think is important to bear in mind, is going to be betting the turn with a very, very wide range here that still contains a lot of air. Okay. I also think it's important to pay attention to the king river and how little our opponent is meant to be betting king high on the turn, right? King high in these blind on blind spots plays a lot like ace high would in different spots. Okay, you're kind of just looking to go to showdown with this region of hand. So on the river, what happens is our bluff allowance as the small blind is extremely low, and I think this is a spot where people will make the mistake of thinking that the king is actually a very good river for them, when it in fact is not. Okay, usually you would think king river in a line like this, king's going to be good for the aggressor, right? Because they've got lots of king x in their range. They might start to bluff king x on the turn, and so on and so on. But the issue is in this particular line with ranges this wide, as you can see with the turn strategy, the king is not a fantastic river, right? the big blind actually has an equity advantage here, and the big blind actually has double the amount of top pair, double the amount of king X than our opponent. So on the surface, it might look like, oh, you think, oh, king river, good for the aggressor, I can bluff really wide. But in reality, this is not the case. This is not a great river for the small blind. Therefore, the bluff allowance is really, really low. And they think this kind of misunderstanding of the concept and thinking king good for the aggressor, I'm going to follow through and bluff, leads to our opponent bluffing every single time with the jack-8 offsuit. Or potentially, we don't know. He could have just been, you know, playing pure solver-led poker and really understand the spot really well, and then he's just, you know, rolled a low number with his jack-8 and therefore he's followed through, or he's bluffed every bluff. Okay, so you can see in theory, with our ace-9, we are meant to be completely indifferent, right? We're meant to be calling half the time, folding half the time, give or take, right? It's an okay bluff catcher. It's okay because it has an ace, right? Which is always going to unblock the bluffing region from our opponent. But it also has a 9, which does block some of the bluffs, right? Some jack-9 off, 10-9 off, jack-9 suited, 9-8 off, and so on, right? So it's pretty neutral as a bluff catcher, okay? But as mentioned, our opponent's bluff allowance is very, very low. So if we go into the solver and let's just make our opponent bluff, let's say 40% of his air, right? Let's go with that. So we'll increase that to 40% of his air, which is still honestly very conservative. He's still giving up a lot of his air region here. We've just increased it by a little bit. But if we do this, now what you're going to see is we basically call our entire range, right? You can see that the actual hands that we fold here are just unfortunately the ones that miss. The ones that don't have any showdown value can't really call 10 high on the river because we're losing to bluffs. But everything else becomes a pure call, okay? So it's kind of like our toy game that we did before. Even though there are some blocker effects going on here, right? Blockers will go out the window in this spot if our opponent is going to considerably overbluff, okay? So ace-9, whilst it has positive and negative blockers, is just a call that prints a big blind and a half because our opponent is overbluffing so considerably, okay? Or is likely to be overbluffing considerably. Okay, so this is a really, really nice example of someone's bluff allowance being very low, them following through on the river, and ace-9 isn't actually indifferent on the river. Ace-9 is very likely to be a very, very, very profitable call in this particular run out, in this particular formation. Okay, so it's kind of understanding the ideas, you know, that we mentioned with the run out. He actually gets a bad run out for his range. Also, again, the action, we're in a broken line, right? So a lot of our opponent's value would have gone into a c-bet, right? So we do have to factor that in. A lot of the air is going to go into this line as mentioned. Okay, so, you know, we can go backwards and we can see that, yeah, okay, our opponent is actually going to arrive to the river with a lot of air combos, ace high and below, okay, that are going to be potential bluff candidates on the river, okay? So with all of this in mind, we can make a pretty nice exploitative bluff catch on the river here, and we can make a pretty safe bet that our opponent is going to be over bluffing. Okay. Okay, now a second example for you guys, flipping this concept a little bit. Here we face an open from middle position and we defend the ace-9 offsuit. The board comes down 10-7-3 and the action goes check-check. On the turn, with our ace-9, we elect to go for a 40% size to try and make our opponent fold like a pocket 5s, pocket 6s style hand. Our opponent calls, and then the river comes the king of hearts, and we elect to not bluff with our ace-9, and then our opponent makes the river overbet on the king here. And this is less about ace-9 because ace-9 unfortunately loses to bluffs here. It is not a bluff catcher. But I wanted to kind of use this hand as an example of, imagine we have jack-9 or ace-10 or something along those lines in this particular spot. This is going to be a really, really nice example of our opponent having a very, very high bluff allowance. Okay, so we can just dive into the sim here to illustrate this. So we can see on the flop, we expect our opponent to play some kind of polarized strategy here, but pay attention already to the checkbacks. Checkbacks are going to come a lot from this particular region, so quite a lot of good ace highs. Pay attention to ace king, ace queen, and so on. So then when we bet 40% on the turn, Our opponent's calling range, again, congregates really well around this top left corner region. Yes, they're still defending some of these under pairs, but they are 0 EV. On the river, we are checking our ace-9, and then our opponent has the option of 150% or all in here. Not too bothered about the sizing scheme. What I want to pay attention to is my opponent's bluff allowance. Okay, so you can see of the ace-high and no-made hand he arrives to the river with, he has to bluff it every single time, and he actually has to turn some showdown value style hands, i.e. 4s, 5s, and 6s, into bluffs here in order to reach the required bluffing frequency. Okay, now this is already an interesting concept that the solver is utilizing here, because these hands like pocket 5s and pocket 4s, they have EV checking back because they do win at showdown. It's going to beat ace-9. If you have pocket 4s, you're actually going to beat my ace-9, for example, and so on. But because the runout is so good for the in-position player, because the king is so unbelievably good for the in-position player, you actually then have to turn some showdown value into bluffs in order to ensure that you have enough bluffs. So when this is the case, again, it's like a nice little pro tip. If you are relying on your opponent to turn showdown value into bluffs in order to reach the required bluffing frequency, it's kind of unlikely that they're going to overbluff. It's more likely that they are going to underbluff. Okay, when you arrive to a spot where your opponent's bluff allowance is quite literally bluff every bluff plus take some showdown value and bluff that as well, it's likely that our opponent is not going to overbluff in this kind of spot. I'm not saying that they're never going to overbluff or anything like that. We are, of course, estimating, but the likelihood is when the bluff allowance is very high and you have to turn some showdown value into bluffs, it's not really going to be happening. So ace-9, obviously really easy decision because we lose to bluffs, but if we did have a hand like jack-9 or if we had a hand like ace-10, then in reality here, this is going to be really, really tough. This is going to be really, really probably not profitable to click call with these kind of hands. It's kind of like, if you think about the best case scenario here, the best case scenario is our opponent just reaches the required bluffing frequency, generally speaking, and we have like a 0 EV decision with ace-10. Worst case scenario is they underbluff, and we should probably be folding. Okay, so this is another example of, again, how the runout can really dictate things and how bluff allowance is really going to impact whether our opponent is going to overdo it or underdo it. Okay, so we really, really want to pay attention to this throughout. Right, I think we'll call that a video there. Please, guys, let me know what you think in the comments below. I realize that this is just touching the surface. Bluff catching is obviously a very, very large topic, and there is definitely more to cover in this particular spot. You know, we can talk about positions, we can talk about more on the action, we can talk more about the runout and so on. We can talk about previous streets and so on. So if you guys would like some kind of part 2 later down the line, please let me know and I will be happy to oblige. But yeah, also again, as always, let me know what you think of the video in the comments below and what you want to see in the future. But yeah, we'll GG it there, have fun, and I'll see you guys on the next one.